Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining today's webinar, Test Automation in March. My name is Sandman from Inflectra, and I'd also like to introduce my colleague, Thomas Haver, who will be speaking as well. So we have two great presentations today. The first one will be, I guess, by me, so hopefully it's good. I'll be talking about testing the Moz 500 top websites and how tools that involve artificial intelligence and big data can help. And then after that, Thomas will be talking about the rise and benefits of robotic process automation, or RPA. And I've spoken before with Thomas several times. He's a good friend of mine, and I think you've got a really good set of talks. Especially his talk is going to be great, and I look forward to hearing what he's going to have to say. But before we do that, I'm going to jump then into my talk. It should be about an hour, from 11 o'clock Eastern to 12 o'clock Eastern. And then at 12 o'clock, Thomas will be taking over with the RPA talk. So again, welcome again to the webinar on test automation in March. It's great to have you here. Let me go ahead and hopefully share my screen, and hopefully this will work. 1 second. Okay. There we go. Move this out of the way. There we go. All right. So thanks again for joining today's talk. My talk is going to be about testing the Moz 500 top websites and how you can use artificial intelligence and other big data tools to help you along the way. So first of all, just a little bit about me. I actually come from the programming side, not from the testing side, so don't hate me for that. I've been a programmer since the age of 10. I've always loved technology. I've been working professionally in the IT industry for 25 years. But before that, I was, as a child, as a kid, as a high schooler, I was writing software, and you can even find some of my computer games online that still run in emulators today. Currently, I'm the founder and CEO of Inflectra Corporation. Inflectra is a company that provides tools for test automation, tools for test management, requirements management, and risk-based testing. If you'd like to learn more about tools at Inflectra, you can go to our website. If you'd like to connect with me personally, I'm always interested in doing that. You can find me most actively on Twitter and LinkedIn these days. Twitter for short messages, and LinkedIn if you want to have a more in-depth conversation. But let's focus on the talk today. For today's agenda, I want to talk a little bit about why is test automation so hard? And I'm sure you want to know about this because this is a test automation series of webinars. And I'm going to be focusing really on web test automation, because really test automation itself can cover many different aspects: mobile apps, web apps, desktop apps, console, bots. There's lots of different kinds of test automation, APIs, and so on. But I want to talk specifically about web test automation and why is that so uniquely hard. And then I want to look at a research project that we did where we looked at the most popular websites called the Moz 500. I'll explain what that is in a minute. And then, using what we found from that research project, look at ways you can improve your test automation strategies. Some of this will be quite technical. We'll be getting down into the CSS and the XPath locators. So if you're a test automation person, you will love this. If it's something that you're maybe more of a novice, something you're learning, don't worry. There's lots of good general concepts. Some of the more technical aspects you can just park for later. And then I'll be looking at some specific tips and tools and techniques you can use. So, and then we should wrap it up with some questions. So let's start at the beginning, like any good research project. It began with a question, or as we say in science, a hypothesis. And the question really was, why is test automation so difficult? And I think more importantly than difficult, unreliable. And we all hear about test automation being difficult to do, but also very hard to maintain. Unreliable in the sense that automated tests that you write one day no longer run correctly the next day. And that tends to give people the feeling that there's not necessarily a return on investment in test automation, and that manual testing is better, and that why automate tests if they're going to break a week later and require them to be rewritten. And these are valid criticisms, or valid concerns, at least, of test automation if it's not done well. And I want to talk about why is this the case fundamentally, and we'll look at, again, some things we found that explain both why it's the case and what we can do about it. So we thought as well, before we get to the Moz 500, One of the things we do notice about web testing, particularly, is that it seems to be a uniquely difficult domain to test. We look at other apps like mobile apps and desktop apps, it isn't quite so bad. So that's why we decided to focus on web applications. So therefore, what we thought was, well, where do we find web apps to look at? Let's do some analysis. And it's not just looking at web apps in a static sense, but looking at web apps over time. And we thought, let's look at the most popular applications in the world. And what are those? Well, those are the 500 top websites as ranked by the Moz search engine optimization optimization system. So if any of you do digital marketing or know anyone who does digital marketing, you will have probably heard of things like PageRank or Moz or domain authority or page authority. These are actually all terms that are used when you're doing search engine optimization to see how authoritative a website is. Where does Google rank it? Is it something that Google uses as its top results or something that's down the bottom? And the company Moz provides a lot of tools to help you figure out which websites have got the highest traffic, and they rank those in what's known as the Moz Top 500. And this will show you the 500 most visited websites in any given time period. So what we decided to do was, let's look at these websites. I mean, you can see here things like Facebook, Twitter, Google, YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn, WordPress, Pinterest, Wikipedia, and WordPress. That's just the top 10. These websites have a lot of money. The companies have some of the best developers in the world. They've invented some of the newest automation frameworks and some of the newest web frameworks, like Twitter invented Bootstrap, Google invented Angular. So when you look at React, this comes from Facebook as well. So when you look at web applications that we're building today, many of the frameworks and technologies we're using to build these applications comes from these companies. So whatever they're doing is going to massively impact how everyone else is building web apps. So we thought, well, let's look at these web apps and see how easy would these be to test. And if we wrote tests, how stable and reliable would they be? So what we did, actually, before we get into what we found, we looked at all these 500 websites and we did a crawl of them using some automation tools that we have. And we looked at them not just once, but we took snapshots over time to see how did these websites change. So we basically performed a giant set of test automation on all these websites over time, built some automation scripts automatically using some spidering and bot tools. And then we said, well, let's use that test that we just recorded and try and replay it over multiple time periods to see how reliable they were. And if they weren't reliable, find out why they weren't reliable. And then try and do some analysis to see, how accurate would test automation be against these sites. And the idea being that if we can test these applications well, if there are tools and techniques that we can use to test these well, there's a relatively good chance that those techniques will work for other websites. Because again, if you're using Twitter and it's using Bootstrap or Facebook and React or Google and Angular, guess what? You've probably got other apps using the same frameworks with the same issues and the same limitations and the same difficulties. Okay, so what did we find? Well, we ran this big data analysis. We found that, first of all, lots of things we found that you're supposed to accept as true are not the case. So when we write automation scripts, whether we're using a tool or using a framework or doing it by hand, in case doing test automation, one of the problems is we have some assumptions that we hold to be true when we're doing automation. Well, the very first one is, if you look at the W3C, on any given web page, regardless of how many components and frameworks are on that page generating content, IDs are supposed to be unique. It's a basic assumption on a website. An ID does not appear more than once on a page. Unfortunately, we found in our analysis that was not the case. IDs were being reused. Because you have different frameworks that don't know about each other, maybe one framework guarantees they're unique, but it's on a page with another framework. Well, they're not guaranteed to be unique across the frameworks. When the browser looks at the page, it just sees multiple IDs that are the same. Once you've got multiple IDs that are the same, IDs become effectively useless as a method for locating pages on the items on the page for test automation. All right. So, okay, first problem, IDs are not unique. So, okay, if IDs are not unique, that's not a problem, right? We have other attributes. IDs are not the only attribute. If you go to any web page, any DOM object, any browser view, of any web page, you should be able to find multiple attributes. So let's look at other attributes. And also, before I do that, I should also mention that even where there were IDs unique, they oftentimes were dynamic or semi-dynamic. So we look here at a web page, and the IDs that exist, a large percentage of the ones that exist are dynamic, or either fully, like just a bunch of numbers, like a session ID, or they're semi-dynamic, like the ones in the middle, the card group or the module. They're repeating multiple times. They're not very useful. There were some IDs that were static, like the footer, the header, the main body. There are some major elements that are static, and we'll come back to that later because that is helpful, but not necessarily by itself. So on the left-hand column, things like footer, leaderboard, footer, else button, headphones, things like that, contact us blocks, anything like that that's static is worth using in automation, but it may only give you access to a block of the page, not a specific control that you want to act on. So it's useful, but not necessarily by itself. Once you get into the dynamic IDs, or certainly even some of the semi-dynamic ones, those are very hard to automate because every time you refresh the page, it might change. And sometimes it's hard to know, is that ID a meaningful ID, like it's an ID of an item that will, in a shopping cart that will be useful, or is it an ID that if I reload the page, it's different next time? Could be both. So the other problem, as I mentioned, there was, okay, IDs not unique, and if they are unique, a lot of random number IDs that are just not very useful. But there are other attributes around. So what attributes can we use? Well, we can use the class or CSS attribute. Now the reason that's obviously used is that affects how the page looks. So web pages that want to actually present information to the user have to use class attributes. It's a way of styling the page. So the good news is they're being used a lot. There's obviously a problem with them we'll come back to in a second, but that is good. Now href, which are links, obviously you have to use those as well to get anywhere. That's useful to know. The problem is that once you get outside of those two, there's not a lot of consistency about what other attributes are being used. And most of them are not being used at all or very little. So things like style and target, right, those are used on links. Source, title tags. Now title is a great way, it's a tooltip. It's a great way of just documenting what something's meant to do. 2% of the time it came up. Alt tags, which would be very useful for finding information because it gives you a way of describing something, not used. Role, which is one of the accessibility attributes not being used. Very quickly, you can see here, not a lot of useful attributes consistently being used across sites, apart from really the top three, and maybe the style attribute. So basically, class, href, style, and target are the ones that are, other than IDs, that are in use. So that gives us a very limited range of attributes, unfortunately. So for example, if we look at Microsoft Dynamics Central, Business Central, which is an ERP application that's web-based, you can see here that the class attribute is by far the one that's being used across pages. There's almost nothing else being used that much. There's an area label attribute, which you can see here. That's quite useful because it's something that you can put metadata that's meaningful. The control name, there's something called D, and a title tag. So, you could use title, label, and the control name. That would be useful. Class is by far the biggest entry on most elements. So for test automation, what are you going to do? There's very few attributes there to find things. So when you're going to automate clicking on a button, entering text, it's not necessarily very easy to find something that's reliable. So the challenge there right now is looking at this application. This is, again, a typical application by Microsoft. The biggest class you can use, the biggest tag you can use is class. Now, the problem we get into then is if we have classes as the most predominantly used attribute on a web page, that's going to be a problem because classes are being used to style the page, and sometimes they're being generated by frameworks. In this case, it's Google Drive that you're seeing here. So it's not just Microsoft we're picking on. And you can see here, look at these classes. You've got a bunch of letters, A-S-TB. It's all random generated dynamic classes and closures which are being generated here. So it's a giant tree of divs and other elements with lots and lots of random classes. So trying to use class here is difficult because it's W-A-S-A-C-A-I-K-D. I mean, it's meaningless. And it's this giant nested tree of them. So whereas if you were going to click on a button and you hope it's going to be some class like button, unfortunately it's not. It's very random and very generic. And there's lots of them repeating. So that was the other thing we found, that where we are using classes on these large frameworks and large applications, unfortunately, it's actually sometimes hard to use class because there's so many random classes that don't really give you any meaningful information to automate on. And part of the problem why this is happening is that, back in the day when we wrote web apps by hand, you could give meaningful names to things. The problem with a lot of frameworks like Angular, React is that if you're not careful or if you're not intentional, they generate large amounts of tags. They generate HTML tags. They generate large amounts of attributes. They don't put IDs on things. And they generate things in a way that makes it very easy to write the code and maintain it and generate the JavaScript and generate the HTML from these libraries. But it makes it much harder to automate because they're generating a lot of random information that the browser's fine with, but from an automation standpoint, it's not very meaningful. The next problem we ran into when we looked at the data analysis back to the Microsoft example was, even if we have classes that here might be somewhat meaningful, like SPA view, perhaps that's a view we want to look at, what we have also is multiple layers. So what they're doing here is, rather than when you click on a button and a menu comes up, rather than it simply getting rid of the menu and creating the menu the next time, what it was hiding the menu by making it behind. So what happens is, if you write a test that uses this attribute and this div and this class and so on, and you try and click on a button, what will happen is the menu pops up. That's great. You click on an item in the menu. That's great. That's your test. Now when you play back the test the second time around, the first menu is still there. The second menu is just in front of it in terms of the Z index, the layer, but the old menu is still there. What happens is the test will try and click on the old menu, not the new menu, or maybe the other one. It's indeterminate. So what will happen is, you're clicking on the wrong menu. Instead of clicking on what you think is the active menu, you'll be clicking on perhaps a menu from 2 tests earlier. And again, not very obvious. So that's an issue where you have that. So the other thing also, you notice here, yet again, we've got 2 forms and 2 IDs of the exact same ID on the same page, which again is not allowed. If we tried to use the ASP.NET form as a control entity to record a test against, we click on it, and actually we're going to click on the wrong one because there's 2 of them. And again, the browser won't know which one we want. So it reinforces we've got duplicate elements, but we also now have the problem of hidden frames and hidden layers. And the same thing happens on Salesforce. We did a test on some Salesforce apps. You can see the same thing. We've got the exact same button. It's in 2 different places with the exact same set of items. One is hidden, one is visible. So it can either be hidden or it can be just a different index on the layer. Either way, what's going to happen is, you think you're clicking on this button, you're actually clicking on the button from 5 minutes ago that's now hidden. Either way, your test is going to fail when it should pass, or it's going to pass when it should fail. And that creates flaky tests. And once you get flaky tests that don't reliably run, people will lose confidence in your automation. So that's some of the problems we run into, is that. Let's just recap. First of all, IDs are not unique. Attributes are not widely used outside of the style attributes, the class attributes, and the href. The class one is unfortunately heavily influenced by the need to present the information to the user, so it tends to change a lot, and it can be dynamically generated to create styles, and it can be repeated. And then the third part was, even if those are not the case, the same element may exist multiple times with different layers, different levels, these indexes, or may be hidden. So that makes it a very difficult job to create automated tests that are reliable. So then the question we asked back is, okay, so that's the world as we saw it. We did this again for 500 different websites. We took snapshots over time, and we watched how those applications both change, but also by reloading the same application many times, we could see which elements are stable or which elements are not stable. If you refresh a page and the ID is the same, it might be stable. If you refresh the page and the ID is different, then it's probably a session ID or some kind of session-specific identifier. Now, what can you do? Now, if it's an application you're building in-house, using one of these, or a custom framework, or just by hand, or whatever it is, one of the things you can always do is ask your developers to actually improve the testability of the app. They can add attributes, like ARIA attributes, other metadata that doesn't affect how it looks or works, but documents the items so that users who are doing test automation can actually test it more easily. Now, there are tools that can help you do some of this. So there are automation tools, both open source, that as part of the test automation process will actually analyze the page over multiple trees, multiple sessions, and can actually give you recommendations as to how you should automate it. What attributes make sense, what attributes don't make sense, and if you find there's nothing coming back that makes sense, then that may be a conversation to have with the developers. One thing you can also do is have your developers look at using the same tools you're using. So in the Agile methodology, you should be pair programming and pair testing to some degree. And so perhaps you have the developers write the happy path tests using the same automation tool that you're going to use to write the edge case tests on the non-happy path. So as much as possible, if you force developers to try and automate their own work, they'll see the limitations of their own system, and it will incent them to actually do a better job. And that will actually help. Unfortunately, this isn't always possible. There are packaged apps from third parties like Dynamics, Salesforce, SAP, Oracle, you name it, any of the big apps that are out there, Dropbox. If you're automating any application that you don't have the code for, you're stuck. Or maybe it's an application like a Salesforce plugin that you're writing where you can control your piece of the world, your plugin, but it's running on a platform like Salesforce where you can't control the rest of the application. And that can make test automation difficult. And you don't have the ability to refactor, rewrite the code that you're testing. So now you're stuck with a world where the automation is limited by the things we've seen, and you can't change the code that's generating these web pages to make it better. So what could you do? Before we get into that, one aside I'd like to mention is, why is it so bad for web apps? Why do we not talk about mobile apps and desktop apps in the same way? Well, one of the reasons actually is, if you go back into test automation, when we used to do test automation for desktop apps many years ago, people would write apps using something like Visual Age for Java, or Eclipse, or IntelliJ. If it was Visual Studio, maybe Visual Studio. There were lots of tools that you'd use to build a desktop app. Similarly with mobile apps, you're using Xcode or using Android Studio. What happens is you're putting in controls and dragging out items and building out a control like a button or a grid or a group by box. You're not hand coding HTML or tags. All of these tools have to build out the actual application, and those tools would usually, to some degree, force it to put a meaningful name in, to put in a metadata, to put some alt text in. Those automation tools that we used to actually write the system, the 4G it needs to be called, those tools would actually enforce good development practices. The problem with web applications is, first of all, you can write it in Notepad if you want to. And secondly, the frameworks, although they do provide benefits in terms of building out UI elements, they're typically being done still in a text editor, where if you're using TypeScript to write React, you're still using ultimately Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio or some other tool to write the web pages. So even though we do have frameworks to make web app creation better, the tools, the IDEs, aren't enforcing good test automation standards the way that mobile apps and desktop apps do. So that is why I think fundamentally you're going to get the most problem with web apps. Okay, anyway, so we've talked about what can we do if we have access to the code. Well, we can help our developers do things to make the application better. We can do everything that we saw in the previous slides that they're not doing. They can add IDs that are unique. They can add more attributes that aren't style or classes, and so on and so forth. So what if we can't do that? We are stuck with the application that we get. And maybe this application is updating every month, like Salesforce or Microsoft Office 365, for example, or Dynamics. We're sort of stuck with the application and its update cycle. So the first thing we can do is let's look at some of the examples. So let's say we have a button with a dynamic ID. Here's an example here. It's a button. It's got a random ID, and it's got a span under it with some text. Another example would be the type called button, where it's got this concatenated set of dynamic and non-dynamic elements. So it's part of an invoice. It's got a number, which might be the row, we're not sure, and then some actions tab, and then a button. And the last one is, again, something where you've got a stable bit at the front, dynamic bit at the end. So what can we do? Well, instead of using the ID, we could try using the attributes, class and role and ID. Well, we have type called button. That could be useful, but there is no class and there's no role. Now, we do want to avoid the IDs and classes that are random. So we want to avoid the 3 and the 8, 7, 3, 8, 7, 1, 2 part. We also want to avoid using the full X part of the button. We don't want to go /HTML /body /div blah 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 blah, because any part of your page changes, it's going to break your test. So the first thing you might want to do is look to see, can we find an index? Is it like the first button? Or if it's like the second one is the third row of an invoice, maybe we look for the third row in button on an invoice rather than trying to get the ID of the button. The last option, which is the one that I think people often forget, is text. Now, text is a good option because ultimately the application has to be used by a human. So that button where we see type is button and ID is something else, we don't see here what the text is. The text has got to say something like, new invoice or submit or something like that. So text is really useful because we know it has to be meaningful to the user, therefore it has to be meaningful for the test automator. And if you combine that with like the index and maybe the parent element, so for example, maybe we know that the custom free invoice is stable and we know all the rest of it. And all we do is look for a button called submit in the third row that uses that first part. Now we've got something that's meaningful. It's the third button of a row of a grid that's a list of invoice line items, instead of simply saying, click on, ID 89EF7, which is meaningless. So looking for meaningful segments of the button itself or the item itself and the parents to it is really helpful, putting them all together. The other thing we can do is some technologies will actually not look for a single ID and a single like XPath or CSS, which is the way a lot of people write their Selenium tests, but instead, let's look at a group of locators. So one of the things I see that's very interesting is when you start to do test automation, when you're a manual tester, as a human, what you're doing is you are opening up an application, you're clicking on things, and as a human, it makes sense, right? It's an invoice, it's got 5 lines, I'm going to add 5 items to my invoice, click, add invoice, add item, pick, supplies, it's buying a stapler, all of that stuff. As a human tester, as a test analyst, this is very meaningful. It makes sense to me. Once we get to test automation, we've seen people, it's crazy. You have to become a computer. You're turning humans into computers, basically. You're saying, let me click on that button. Well, let me do F12 in the browser. Let me click on the DOM selector. Let me find out what the ID of the CSS or the XPath is for that button. Let me put it into my Java code. And eventually I'll get, after a lot of time, I'll get an automation framework. But I'm basically having humans behave like computers. Instead, what you should do is have tools, use tools that actually make it easier for you. So when you click on that button, it will come up and say, look, here's how the 6 different ways we can find that button. And based on our experience of this page, even loading it twice, a tool could tell you, well, I loaded this page twice for the exact same display, and all these things change between the 2 different loads. Guess what? Those are not good locators. Don't use any of those. This last one, maybe the normalized space tax equals modules. That's the way to do it. So we need to have tools that basically help humans make intelligent decisions, as opposed to having humans try and pour through large amounts of data and try and make decisions based on incomplete information. So I say test automation is really about an AI and machine learning is going to be about how do we give the tester who has to ultimately test a business transaction like adding an invoice, how do we help them automate tests in a way that makes it more meaningful for them versus them trying to use the tool where they have to pour through pages and pages of DOM and XPath and HTML and all this code, trying to ascertain what they should be using in their code. Okay, another example which illustrates the same problem is this one. So we've got this form, and it's got a bunch of divs, and you can see here it's got a button, it's got some spans, and a lot of times when people start to write automated tests, they go to the browser, they look at the button that contains the spans, and they click on it, and they use the browser tools and say, get me the XPath to get to that button. And they copy it from the browser and they stick it in their automation code, again, Selenium code or whatever they're using, whatever framework they're using, and they get something that looks like the top item. And then it works and they go fine, and they play it back a week later in the pipeline and it breaks. And they're like, oh, great. So now you've got a flaky test. And so the problem is you do that over and over again, and now you've got 2 weeks of test automation that's basically throwaway. Versus if you actually either by hand use intelligence to try and figure out what's stable or not, or again, have tools that look at it and say, based on reloading this page 10 times with different data, we've determined that the role exists and is meaningful, and the label customers exist and is meaningful in this example. That's the kind of locator we want. And again, it's not necessarily easy for a human to do that on a single look at a page. What you want is to reload the page multiple times and have a computer look at the data and say, oh, this is across these 8 times of loading that page with different data sets, this is what's meaningful, this is what changes, this is what doesn't change. And the next thing would be, how do we deal with hidden layers? So here you've got 4 layers, all with the exact same menu, and they're all stacked on top of each other. So what you need to do basically is use code to basically either use something like the control name, which is meaningful, and avoid the 2 items that have the same ID. And in the case of the case where it's the view with the Z index, we need to add a position last. So again, humans that means as a test automator, you either have to remember to add things like position last to every single automation code line, right? Or have tools that know, okay, we see 4 layers are the same, let's automatically add position as last to our recorded locator. So finding ways to reduce the amount of manual error and human coding is critical, because this is complicated and it isn't obvious unless you're looking at this data. Unless you looked at this over multiple loads, you wouldn't see this. You just see one index. Okay, so that's some of what you need to do is you need to basically find ways to more uniquely identify the different layers, different items, and make sure that whenever you build a test out, don't just take what the browser's giving you. Don't just put in this top item that you see here and stick it into your code and repeat this for every single button you're clicking on. You need to make sure you understand the changeability of your code, the changeability of the application, and which parts of it are going to live beyond the page refresh. And the other thing will obviously be when you get to cloud applications, the second problem you're going to have is not only does the page change when you refresh the page, but next month, the page might actually change because they can change the actual application. And we do see this more and more. So the second problem is also the time taken to create these tests becomes less useful if the application is changing in ways that break your tests. And we found situations where Microsoft, for example, in their Dynamics platform, every month they're releasing updates. And in those updates, they've literally replaced entire grids with other grids. And to a human tester, they look broadly similar. It's an invoice with line items, so there's line item grid. But unfortunately, to the actual machine behind the scenes, they're completely different grids. There's no commonality apart from data in it. So using things like text probably would work because that's still the same. But things like IDs and styles and attributes were very unreliable. And it was actually really crazy where they would actually put a new grid in 1 month. And then the month later, they went back to the old grid because maybe people didn't like it. And so all the old code would have been useful again. The new code was no longer not useful. So again, it makes automation very difficult. All right. So what can vendors do? And vendors, I'm talking about people who make tools that you're using. This could be open source tools. It could be an internal tool. It could be commercial tools. So I think when we talk about AI, machine learning, I think we're not yet at the point where a machine can look at a web page and say, not yet, and say, I'm an accountant. I understand. How do I create an invoice? How do I add line items? What's a correct operation of an accounting tool? But what I think AI tools and machine learning tools can do is give you as the test analyst and the test creator tools to look at the applications and look at the data and look at the pages and be able to suggest better automation strategies. So they can detect dynamic IDs very easily. You run the page 5 times, look for the IDs that change. Simple as that. They can look for the attributes and see how easy is it to find things on a particular set of pages by specific kinds of attribute. They can analyze classes and look for what we call anchors. Anchors are the stable part of a class or an ID. So when you go back to the example earlier on, let me go back to this one. Yeah. Here you can see that part of that ID is actually stable. The cost-free invoice is stable. The 3 is not. The accounting actions tab is semi-stable. So you might be able to have a machine go in and see, look at that. I can figure out that the first part and the second part are stable, and I'll ignore the bits in the middle and the last bit at the end, maybe. Again, a machine could run this over multiple data sets for a particular application and see which bits are stable. So the key is scan the application, find the parts that are consistent, find right away which bits will let you find the element. Basically, if you take an element on the page, figure out how you might find it, try and find it. Do you get the same thing? Is it the same? Is it different? Do you get more than one back? Do you get none back? And if that works, great. If not, when you try and run the test, maybe you can find a way using fuzzy matching to find the nearest element and find out if it's the same. And that's one of the holy grails right now is what's called self-healing tests. That's a test where when you've recorded it or built out the test and you play it back, the system can handle slight changes where the change is not material to the test. Now, obviously, that's a dangerous piece because you might end up passing something that has failed. Because when something is changed, how much does it need to change for it to be a failure? Like we thought clicking on this button would do something. Well, it does something different. But is that different, the same different, or different different? Is it passing or failing? And that's obviously a dangerous part. If we make the margin of error too great and then it's too fuzzy, we might be creating false positives, things that actually pass when they really should have failed. The reverse is true. If we're too specific, we may end up with lots and lots of flaky tests that are very susceptible to unrelated changes in the application. All right, so how can we do things? So there are some things you can do. One thing you can do is get a list on a page of attribute values and sort them and see, do we get duplicates? Do we get repeats? Do we get consistency? Look for those kind of cases. The other thing we can do is we can look at, in this case, we're looking at 2 different sales accounts. So we're looking at one sales account and a second sales account. They're 2 of the exact same pages, but with different data elements. So one is customer 1, one is customer 2. But it is the same page. Compare the two, because you've now got an interesting case where you've got two different customer records, but it's the same page layout. And if you put those together and compare them, you will now find which elements are the same because there's a different customer ID, different invoice ID, and which parts have changed because of that, and which parts are the same. Then you can load the same page twice. So what you're doing is you're comparing two loads of the same page and two different pages, two different versions of the page for different data elements. Now you'll see which parts of it changed because the business changed, different customer, which parts of the page changed because it's random, it's a session ID, it just changes every time you load the page. And thirdly, you'll know which parts didn't change in either case. Doesn't matter if you change the customer, doesn't matter if you refresh the page. So you now know which parts are stable for that type of page in general, it's part of the page template. You know which parts of the page do change, but change based on business metrics, business ID, like customer ID. So that's useful to know. And the third part is which part changed randomly and should be ignored. And that helps you build out queries and locators that are going to work across multiple customers, but also understand what customer 1 means as distinct from customer 2. And the other thing we can do is we can look at which attributes let us find things on the page. In this case, we can see that for this particular application, there are basically 4 attributes we can use. Sorry, 5, including class. And that may be different for your application. So what we need to do is use these tools for each application we're testing to figure out which attributes we should use and how we should identify them using these attributes. And then what we can do is we can then define standard anchors like menu item. Maybe it's in this case, the menu item. It could be the view, the SPA view tag. You can see here, there's pieces of the page that we've now find that are stable. We loaded it multiple times. We loaded it with multiple customers. We know what's an anchor. That's a part of the page that doesn't change, even if the data changes, even if the page is reloaded. And we can then append onto that the part of the page that changes when the business changes, when the customer changes. And we can completely ignore the parts that are changing randomly because the page just reloaded, but it's the same customer. So we've now got these anchors and elements that we add on to that to come up with locators that are going to be business specific, application specific, but are stable for that application. And if we do our job well, the system will be able to know what's a meaningful change, what kind of change should we expect. Like in this case, the word username became user space name or vice versa. And the system can actually use these different locators and different techniques, put them together and see, do we think this is a match? It's a 94% probability using these different statistical methods together. So and this is again using one of our tools that we used to actually do this analysis when we did the analysis. So the next thing would be, okay, so if we know that this particular application, say it's Salesforce, say it's Microsoft Dynamics, let's say that we've understood this application, we understand how this application is put together. We've loaded multiple pages multiple times. We've tried it with different data elements, different customer IDs, invoice IDs, whatever it is. And what we now see is we now know this application at its current point in time, until the next update at least, how does it work? So we can now build out a profile. This is what we call a web application profile, just a JSON file that's used to document it. Now, this could be built by hand. You could go in here and say, okay, based on my experience, I know that the IDs should be ignored if they're numeric. If they're empty, we ignore them. I know that we should use name, title, href, role, because we know those are useful. However, if you look at that analysis we did earlier on, where we're doing this systematically, we're using a tool to do this. We're actually calculating which attributes are useful, which attributes should be ignored because they're on very few pages or they change every time. Because of that, we're able to automatically generate the right profile for an application. So what we're doing is we're basically modeling the application. And then once you do that, the system can now suggest to you, based on this application that it knows, what is the right way to locate the button, the link, a menu. But you're not doing it every single time. You do this once for the application itself, for say Salesforce, and now every time we record it or build a test using Salesforce, we know it's going to be stable. Now that doesn't mean you can take that profile and then use it for say Dynamics or SAP. They will need their own profile because we know that each application is using different technologies, and even over time these profiles will change because the applications unfortunately do change. Updates come every month. So just to go through a wrap up of what we talked about. First of all, when we did a look at the 500 most popular websites using some of the most innovative and latest frameworks like Angular, React, Bootstrap, and things like that, we found that the problem is massive. We found that most of the standards that the web is supposed to follow aren't being accurately followed consistently. IDs, attributes, and in fact, the use of these frameworks has often made it worse because people are no longer generating code by hand or even looking at what's generated. These frameworks generate everything without a lot of thought being put into what it looks like in the browser behind the scenes. We also thought that we talked about how if you have a development team that has access to the code and you're building this application, you have the ability to make it better. And then when the cases where you don't have ability to change the application itself being tested, in the terms of current technology, there are tools that can help you analyze the web page so that rather than just simply blindly taking what the browser is telling you is the right way of locating an object in your browser using F12, there are some tools that can look at the browser, look at the page, look at it both once and over multiple times and see what's stable, what's transient. And then, as we said, in the future, what we're going to see is more and more AI/machine learning. And really, it's machine learning, it's not AI, where they're going to look at large amounts of data like we did in this research project, but they're going to do it in real time. They're going to look at your application, scan its pages, scan through every variation of the page across different data sets, like every customer in the database, and then determine how to find things on the page. That doesn't mean the AI is going to come and say, I'm going to do this test for you. But what it will do is hopefully make automation feel more like manual testing, where we as a human who understands testing, we can focus more on edge cases. We can focus more on the business being tested. Are we testing all the right types of customer? Are we testing the right kinds of data? And less time on the mechanics of testing, less time spent building tests, building frameworks, dealing with flaky tests, fixing XPath, fixing CSS, more time on understanding, did we test this for XSS? Did we try SQL injection? Did we think about a customer that's been deactivated? Thinking about the bases that really stress the application and less on the mechanics of it. And hopefully that will mean we're spending more time automating tests than on test automation itself. And with that, we're a little bit ahead of time. I'm going to hand it over to questions. So if you have any questions on the presentation, now is a good time. Let me stop sharing. Hold on. Where's that gone? Oop, stop sharing. Great. If you have any questions, please write them in the window to the right. Let's see. So first question, there's some comments. Is it possible to show the screen any here? All the samples. Okay, hold on. What is the advantage of test automation? So I didn't go into test automation. Now, test automation, the advantage obviously is it's faster on after the first time around. So, for example, let's imagine here, a good example would be I want to log into an application that we built. And I need to log in on Firefox, Chrome, Safari, maybe Opera, Edge, maybe IE, still probably not IE anymore, but let's say 4 to 5 browsers. When I log into the application, I can log in with 10 different types of user. And when I log in, I need to make sure that these different 10 user roles can only see the right parts of the application. Now, a human can do that. You can obviously open a browser up and log in and see what tabs you can see. Imagine doing that. It would take you maybe, 2 or 3 hours. It's incredibly mind-numbing, incredibly boring. Probably what will happen is, one, you'll make a mistake. Halfway through, you'll forget which browser you're supposed to be using, which tab you're meant to be using, or you'll skip a tab. As humans, boring, repetitive tasks are the worst for us. A, we don't like them, but B, we're not very good at them. We tend to forget what we're doing. We tend to make mistakes and either forget a tab, think we saw a tab and we didn't see a tab, all that. So false positives and false negatives. So that's a really bad use case for manual testing because we're going to make mistakes and it's boring. And then let's say you change something in the application to fix it. Well, now you're going to retest it again. Now you're going to tell those testers who just spent a day doing really boring, clicking around, looking at tabs, do it again for me, please. Oh my goodness. So again, not a very good use of time and not very reliable. That's a really good candidate for test automation because you could write that, script it, run it multiple times. It's not a particularly complex flow, lots of data to try out, 10 different users, 10 different, 5 different browsers, 50 combinations basically. That's a really good test automation use case because you'll spend maybe, half a day writing it and maybe 10 minutes running it. So that half a day investment is really worthwhile. However, let's say you've got to do a different kind of test. I've got to create a very complex sale order that will take me as a human 20 minutes to go through all the clicks and all the steps. But I only have to run it once for one user in one browser. Now, it may take me 20 minutes to do it by hand. Automating it might take me 2 days reliably. I'm only going to play it once a month. The ROIs may not be there, and the application is changing quite a lot. Now you might find that manual testing is better. Humans are really good at that kind of test. It's one where we're not doing the same thing over and over again. It's not boring. I need to look at this page. I'm trying this complex flow of multiple steps. It's testing what a user is going to be doing in that flow. Perhaps that should be manual tested for a while, at least until we're going to do more of it. So those are two extreme cases. The first one is really good for test automation. The second one is really good for manual testing. And if you only have a certain amount of time, I would say automate those kind of first tests, get those done. And then obviously, if you get those done and they're working, they're stable, delivering value, you can then move on and do some of the other tests that are more complicated. Okay, so that was that question about why, what is the advantage of automated testing? The main advantage is you want to automate repetitive, boring tests that involve a human being very careful in a way that is not conducive to the way we humans think or act. And that's where automation testing is really good. Any other questions? I don't see any more. So Thomas's talk is going to be in about 15 minutes. So let me check. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to write them. While we're waiting, one question I often get asked is about test automation anyway, is, should I use commercial tools? Should I use open source tools? What's the benefit? So that's always a contentious question. It's interesting. One of the statistics I read, which was very interesting, was that with open source frameworks and Selenium, more and more companies are doing test automation than ever before. Back 12 or 15 years ago, you were using tools from Mercury and things like what's it called, Quick Test Pro, UFT, Test Complete, things like that. Commercial tools that do test automation, and they were expensive, and they obviously require you to buy a license, and they were proprietary, and you couldn't move your tests, and so on and so forth. And I know Selenium is good because it lets anyone write tests. One of the statistics I found that was very alarming, though, was they say that 90% of people are trying automation and 80% are failing. So have we actually improved the state of the art, or have we simply created more and more tests that are not delivering value? So that's one of the challenges when you do a test automation, is that one of the benefits of some of the commercial tools was that they did guide you in the testing, and they could guide you into writing tests that were perhaps more maintainable. One of the challenges we've seen with test automation frameworks is because we often integrate with them. So one of the tools that we sell is a test management tool called Spirotest that integrates with automation tools. And that unfortunately means that we get to hear about all the horror stories of automation frameworks. The problem we find is that as a company, don't let someone go off and write their own automation framework by themselves. Because what will happen is, when you're writing an automation framework, it's fun. You get to build this code, you get to go online, you get to research, you get to build this object model using JSON files. It's going to be very abstract. It's going to be very maintainable. It's really good. However, when you leave the company, what will happen is no one knows how you did it. So if you're a manager and you're going to have team do automation, I would seriously look at open source versus commercial. There's benefits of both. I'm keeping out the politics of that. There's pros and cons. If you automated tools that are commercial will often have pre-built libraries for Salesforce, Dynamics, SAP that maybe take some of the error out of it. They do some of the work for you. They have some intelligence. The vendor will obviously provide support. If the person leaves the company, you get support. It obviously means you're also tied to that vendor, tied to that license. That's the downside. Whether it's open source or it's commercial, however, what I would say is, make sure you have a team do automation. Make sure the knowledge is dispersed so that people keep checks on each other, so people don't build effectively a job for life. If someone leaves the company, you're not left with an unmaintainable framework that no one remembers how it works. And we see that time and again. Someone built this great automation framework. It really worked. The team loves it. It's working every day. The person goes to work somewhere else. The application that's being tested is changed materially. the framework stops working, and then you throw the entire framework away and start again with another one. So I'm ready, Thomas. I'm good. So thank you everyone for attending my talk today. Thomas Haver's coming next. He's got an awesome talk on robotic process automation, or RPA. And thanks again for having me today at this Apple Tech Talk. Hope it was useful. Thanks for the questions. And I'd like to introduce Thomas.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well. So let me go ahead and share my screen here and push away this little button here. All right, thank you very much for joining me. Welcome to the rise and benefits of robotic process automation. And Adam, thank you very much for that fantastic intro. Happy to speak with you today. So a little bit about myself. So as you might tell from my gear, I work for M&T. It's a large regional bank based in New York. But if you're more interested in learning more about automation and DevOps practices, I recommend you check out my team's blog, Red Green Refactor. So before I was in IT, I was a scientist for around a decade. I'm also an avid board gamer. You don't see it behind me today. You see a wall of books, but I have around 3,000 board games in my house and taking up multiple rooms. I'm also an evangelist for Ruby Cucumber. That's my primary tool set I like to use to enable behavior-driven development. And I have a lovely cartoon family here. They're upstairs remaining quiet during my presentation. Thank you very much. Let's drive into it. All right. I'm going to level set with you about finding a shared understanding of what is RPA, as well as why it's important within the industry, because you may have heard about various tooling or various companies going public. So why is this important for you to use? As well as some specific examples on RPA use cases and what you would do if you're going to go through the adoption of your team or an enterprise level. I'm then going to dive into a selection of those tools in the industry, some of which are listed on Gartner or Forrester research as being sort of leaders, as well as take you through some of the metrics that you would use to track at the beginning of your program or in a mature state. And I want to also mention that if you have any questions during the course of this presentation, feel free to ask in the chat. I can answer it during the course or right after we're finished. So first, let's set at what is robotic process automation, or RPA. So RPA is a term that's typically given to technology that allows those developers to programmatically emulate the actions of a human to execute a business process. So the variation from this compared to test automation is you're going to interact typically on a UI level to capture that data or to complete tasks. So rather than going through a validation, you're looking at executing a business process. Similar to test automation, though, we're looking at activities that are repetitive, that are time consuming, and finding a way for a bot to take over that versus having a human do that. This comes into place with some of our terminology that we care about. When I mention bot, what is a bot? A bot is a program sequence of automated activities performed by the tool. They could do something as simple as navigate to a web page, or as complex as provide a decision recommendation on a mortgage loan application. So it's not just about something that's traversing over a web application. You can go much deeper than that. And there are many different types of bots. So the two general categories that we're going to talk about today are attended and unattended bots. Attended bots mean the user is working with the process in the background, such as helping out with data entry assistance and onboarding a new employee for HR. Unattended bots mean the process is executing in absence of human interaction, such as processing invoices. And these will typically take place on servers separate from human activity. If we dive a little bit further into some of the categories of RPA solutions, you have four primary types. Those being assisted, those are bots that are deployed to a local human's workstation that can help with common tasks. Unassisted bots are deployed on a server and can be manually controlled. You have autonomous bots that cover more complicated processes that often have decision trees, such as changing priorities based upon external input or workload balance. Think in terms of also like a listener waiting for an action to occur external and then acting upon it. as well as cognitive, bots that are integrated with AI technologies, such as machine learning and natural language processing. And this is where I have to also make that same delineation that Adam made in his earlier talk. When we say AI, we're using a little bit of branding here. I'll denote that delineation when we get to a certain set of tools that they may say they're AI, but it's really machine learning underneath the covers. So what are some of the benefits of RPA? Why is it so popular, and why is it something that you see across all industry types? Well, for one, it's got a fast return on investment, and that is because most of the commercially available RPA tooling has a lot of pre-built-in libraries that out of the box and very quickly you can get set up and automate a number of flows. You also have a minimal upfront investment for that proof of concept. Again, whether you're working with the tooling itself or going through a firm to help you out, it's very easy to set up. It's very easy to implement your first few flows and to see that immediate return on investment. You also have limited disruptions on the systems they interact with. They typically ride on top of existing systems, as in they work in the background of your own machine, or they work on servers. So they don't take an additional amount of infrastructure typically for the initial setup, but long term, you're going to want to have some form of orchestration. And the question always comes down to, like, do you buy it or do you build it? So there's some open source solutions that are available. Some have catered and changed the terminology, such as like Robot framework that can assist with, building your own with open source. Buying the tools include those libraries that are very helpful. And that is because a lot of these firms work with many common industry types. So they build up a profile of this is what a financial institution is. This is what a retailer is. And so they have those pre-built libraries that allow you to pretty much fill in the blanks and quickly build up your automation flows. So we go with low code or even codeless solutions to help you spin up RPA very quickly. Additionally, RPA can help you out in the space of errors and logging. So we want to know that we're making improvements over human data entry. We know that when we're doing things, we typically get bored, we easily make mistakes, so we want to have automated workflows handle it for us. The tooling itself, though, also provides logging activity. So we want to identify where we have failure points with this task-based automation so we can fix those exceptions. That activity logging also helps because you can ensure regulatory compliance. I'm not sure about the industries that you all work in, but in mine, which is heavily regulated, we need to show evidence, say, of our testing activities or evidence of due diligence we've taken in care of users' data. Being able to provide these activity logs to show that we have the necessary controls in place go a great deal towards minimizing our amount of time spent with internal auditors as well as external auditors. So there are a number of risks and rewards associated with RPA. So the risk, as I mentioned, is if you're working with these bots and these bots have access level that are similar to that of a human, then you risk revealing that personally identifiable information, especially if you're working with production data. You also risk violating SOX compliance if you're in the US. If you're outside the US, you likely have some form of responsibility that is either around personal identifiable information, card information, handling of financial information that you need to adhere to. And so the risk is you create these sort of super bots that have access that go far beyond what a typical human being would have and can work across multiple systems. Having a bot with that level of access is a risk. So that way, people who could potentially gain access to the bot can use it for nefarious purposes. So I'll explain a little bit how you can address this in the future. The other is your program will never proceed beyond your initial or POC stage. And this is common, I would say, with most automation, not just RPA, but even test automation, where you'll set up an initial framework, automate your first few flows, but not have a real plan beyond that initial stage of how you're going to scale it across multiple teams, across your organization. Because RPA is not something that's just going to sit in the technology space. It's going to be applied across multiple business segments within your enterprise. Some of the rewards, as I mentioned, is your speed of processing time over those manual workflows. It's very easy to adopt. It's very easy to scale out. You can achieve that cost neutral status likely in the same calendar year that you choose to adopt an RPA solution. You can implement it across multiple business segments. So it gets you thinking outside the box. Typically, when we go to implementation, we think about purely within, say, the technology space. And we're always also thinking about either some automation related to builds or to testing. This is neither testing nor is it building. It's something that can apply to task-based automation that could help out people in marketing, that could help out individuals within human resources. Additionally, having these bots in place of these manual repetitive tasks will help reduce the errors. And as I mentioned before, you have that built-in logging capability for the failure analysis and regulatory compliance. So let's look at a few RPA use cases. What can RPA do for you? Well, for one, as a general rule, it can help you with repeatable, high volume, and business-centric tasks. Another common set of tasks could be logging into an application, moving files from one source to another, reading and writing to databases, opening emails and attachments, scraping data from web and desktop applications, connecting to APIs, processing content from PDFs. So this is something that I've seen beyond financial institutions, beyond retailers, to legal firms that can help out, to utility companies. It's pretty much, here's a task that humans do not like to do or are prone to error. All right, how can we make it easier by implementing a bot to take this over for them? So let me go in with some specific use cases. In this case, let's look at some text analysis. So we're able to scan documents such as insurance forms, purchase orders, invoices, emails, etc. So with HR, it can assist with the generation of payroll, employee and contractor onboarding, terminations, benefits administration, where we have to do the same sort of data entry again and again and again. For ops, it can help with your inventory management, invoicing, planning, and scanning of contracts. From the service desk, this can help with password resets, scheduling appointments, and address changes. And let me give a specific real-life example. At a prior firm that I worked for, anytime that either a colleague or a customer would call in because they needed to go through a password reset or they needed help with their account, that service desk analyst had to open up anywhere between 3 to 6 different applications to assist that person. This is something that takes time even when someone comes and validated. So we implemented a bot that upon validation of that customer would automatically open up those applications and navigate to that customer or colleague's information. So that way, if you want to do a password reset, very quick to do the validation, reset the password. If you have a problem with your transaction, very quick to get feedback on that. The time it would take to actually open those applications to assist the person was only on the order of, say, like 15 seconds per application is what it helped out with. You think, not that very much, just 15 seconds. However, let's multiply that 15 seconds by the thousands upon thousands of times that people would call in over the course of the year, and that quickly adds up. And that's really what you're looking to do, not just shave like hours or days or minutes off, but even something on the little scale of seconds can help, because the frequency with which you go through this activity matters as well. And that will help add up over time to the hours savings you're looking for. Another specific use case is with ATM data processing. So any time that you go through and you're looking at your batch process for one day over the next, we know that when we're processing the ATM data, it takes a great deal of time because there's a lot of information that's being transferred between those machines and back-end systems. So if we want to look at something, whether it's processing speed of those data records or reduce the time needed to handle that data or potentially look for fraud, we can have bots that help out with those activities that sit on top of those existing processes and help move things along. They can result in fewer errors and faster processing time of those workflows. Another instance that can be used in assistance of test automation is account creation. So this is also something that I can take from my prior work. Anytime that we would want to go through cradle to grave, that mortgage loan origination, working not only internally, but also with the various approvals that have to be external, it would take on the order of days to go through and generate an account and go through the approval process. And when you're going through that process, you're entering information into hundreds of fields. And if you want to look at various conditions, that's going to result in you needing hundreds of different accounts. So even if it only takes, say, 6 minutes per account, if you're doing it, but if you're going across multiple applications, it ends up taking up a lot of time. So if you have a RPA process that's in place that skips through multiple decision points around mortgage length, around those credit ratings, customer status, and whatever conditions that you can think of. You can go through and do the appropriate test data generation that reaches out to those external systems as well and generates the necessary test data for you to test at various points of that loan stage. So this can result in a reduction of processing time and the number of data entry errors that you'll end up having. So in this instance, because this is a multiple day long process, having RPA in place will help us stage all the data we need for our testing activities. So if you're going to go along on an RPA journey and you want to start off with maybe just your team, or you want to start with your organization, just go big at the beginning, what do you actually need to do? So here's what you need to build out a program. You start with a small proof of concept, and you need to align people, process, and technology to be successful. So what are the expectations? Your RPA solution should operate across the same layers of the application as a human worker. You should have libraries that integrate with the standard tech stack and reusable components. You should have it version controlled. Don't think of your RPA solution as something separate from a developed application. It is another application that should receive the same love and care as your development applications. You should set the level of internal technical prowess and determine, based upon the people you have within your organization, are you looking for people to do a lot of hands-on keyboard coding, a low-code solution, or maybe they haven't coded a line in their life and you want them associated with this program? That will determine what tool you're actually going to select. You're also going to look at standards in place for defect tracking and associated test coverage. You want to set those up at the beginning. You want to not only track the defects you create in writing those RPA processes, but also in determining what you can define for those applications that you're covering over the top of with your RPA flows. So when you are building, you should keep the enterprise in mind. So if your expectation is long-term to be an enterprise-wide deployment, then you have to care about scalability and deployment strategy as an upfront concern. So questions to ask yourself: are you going to run the bots on virtual machines or in the cloud? Are the bots going to be attended, unattended, or both? Will the platform support web services? Do you have a central app or application server to help orchestrate all of these flows? And what security standards do you have in place? A number of the tools that are in place today have an orchestrator. And I would say this is an absolute necessity if you're looking to expand your execution beyond, say, a single team. The purpose of an orchestrator is to track your execution, keep a separation of duties between multiple bots, maintain execution schedules that will keep those loads even across time, track your total execution time for your bots, log all events that occur, and support execution so that way you can quickly investigate. If you think about this, if you did not have an orchestrator in place, you will have various groups, multiple teams, each developing their own solution, each with varying levels of support as well as logging, and you kill off any chance you have for that reusability of flows that traverse across multiple application types. So you need to have some central form of execution to control this. Without execution, you have those runaway bots that are poorly tracked. So it's important to maximize your benefits by having flows that can be reused across multiple teams. So some words of warning. I mentioned this earlier, and I'm going to mention it again because this is where I see people really run the risk of failure. In that if you create bots that go across multiple application types and they have privileges that go far beyond that of a typical user, then those bots can be misused. That's why you want that orchestrator in place. So that way you can limit the access an individual bot has, and you can have that information passed between those bots. So multiple bots should be used to create the separation of duties. You should also try to have some degree of governance in place, at least at the same level as human workers, and use something like a credentials vault to help store this information, or use role-based access control. Include those activity logs that you have from the orchestrator and create audit trails. So that way you can ensure that you have the necessary controls in place to develop this solution. So when you're building out this team, what are some roles and responsibilities that you should look for? These can be people from within your organization as well as outside your organization to work on this initial POC. You need to look at it from the tactical as well as the strategic standpoint. From the tactical side, you need to have one or more RPA developers. These are individuals responsible for developing and testing those bots, scripting things out for you. You should also have an architect. This is someone who's going to design the solutions, select the tooling, establish guidelines for adoption across the enterprise. From the strategic side, you need to have a champion. So this is a person that is comfortable going with those C-level executives and talking to them to advocate for the RPA solution. I'm not sure about your circumstance at your company, but at almost all of the ones that I've worked at, you have these gigantic silos based upon business segments. So each one sort of acting like it's their own kingdom. Your solution needs to be something that's enterprise-wide. So you need to have that champion who's willing to go out to each one of those segments and advocate for why you need to adopt RPA. Here's the funding and the time that you need from members of the teams. And that is because from the strategic side, you are going to have RPA analysts. These are people who have domain knowledge about the business and are responsible for creating the process flows. The problem is, because these are so important people, they're likely going to be your source of system constraint, as in they will be booked up for other projects and activities and hard to get their time to help you out in building out these initial flows. So that's why that champion is important, to go and get the time of these RPA analysts who are going to help you out. These are the folks who you would be considered to be your SMEs, or subject matter experts, who are going to assist you out. Right. Going beyond the people aspect, when we're selecting tooling, we have to make the right call. There's no one tool that is better than another. It's based upon your organization structure. What is going to be the best fit for you? So when you're looking for the right tool for the job, the key questions you should ask yourself when shopping is, will you want to pay on a per transaction or per process basis? Do you want to pay for fixed usage or variable usage capacity? Do you have access to training and documentation? What is the product support model? How often is the platform updated? What does their feature roadmap look like? Who are the business partners for these organizations, and can these pre-built libraries be used immediately? I'd say the last one is a key component, because many of the commercial tools available in the industry have relationships with other tooling firms in the industry, and you want to make sure that whatever you buy can fit neatly within the tech stack that's pre-existing. You want to minimize the amount of change that you have to undergo to implement this solution. As I mentioned, there are a lot of tools available on the market, and some of which are being bought up. And in fact, recently it was announced that Blue Prism would be bought up by another firm. Softmotive was another firm that in 2020 was acquired by Microsoft to help with their Power Automate solution. So it's hard to say, all right, this is the tool I'm going to go with, or I'm going to do a POC with each one of these. You often don't really have the time to do so. So you want to have a sort of subset that match it. So here's a few that we would consider to be leaders within the industry. The first of which is Blue Prism. So they have their own IDE that has a low technical hurdle compared to most traditional automation, but you do have to do some programming. The design of their IDE is very much a drag and drop, similar to like if you have experience with Visio diagrams, you're going to do the same thing here. Is here's an action, here's fill in the blanks for what sort of credentials you need to enter, or what you're looking for on the web page or the screen or the database. It also has Citrix and virtual desktop infrastructure integration. And I would say what you're going to find amongst the most popular tools in the industry is they will all offer third-party accreditation for certification, along with their own style of university programs. So they want to make sure that people become certified developers with their tools, so that way companies have confidence in hiring those individuals. Or if you're looking to upskill people within your own organization, you can have them go take the training and earn the certification. Automation Anywhere was a tool that was originally focused on desktop solutions, but they expanded their offerings to include most application types. You can build RPA workflows with a low technical hurdle, so low code solution. But if you want to build out more advanced workflows, you're going to need something like XML or C# experience. Again, it's not too in-depth. It just matters about the level with which you want to add test coverage to your RPA framework, as well as the logging activities associated with it. Automation Anywhere has a central control feature, that orchestrator we care about, that allows for scheduling and triggering capabilities. And they too offer accreditation for certification. So they're sort of another big boy on the block that's worthy a look if you're going through a POC. Power Automate, which is formerly called Flow, is a solution provided by Microsoft. And this sort of delves into a different region of RPA solution. I'd say this is more personal based, as in something that people would have as an attended bot that's working on someone's local workstation as opposed to like a server. And I'll give you an example for why in here is Microsoft is looking to have something that's easy for people to adopt right now. And if you're accessing this presentation right now from a Windows machine, you can actually pull up and start on a Power Automate flow locally. So what they wanted to do is implement a solution that has a low entry barrier. So anyone can start at no cost, and you can deploy this locally, and there's a vast amount of training and resources available online for you to get kicked off. Their platform, though, includes process discovery, automation ideation, ROI calculation, portfolio management. They also provide native support for OCR, which is optical character recognition, document handling, analytics, and I put this in quotes again. We go back to Adam's, branding on here. The AI builder has pre-built and customizable AI models for processing structured and unstructured content. And I'll provide an example of that shortly. So Power Automate, like many of the other popular tools in the industry, have those templates available to make it very easy for you to spin up and implement a flow. In this case, they've got 600 templates designed for a specific purpose. As you can imagine, a lot of the templates that they have in place are in that sort of Microsoft stack. So there's a template if you wanted to send yourself a text message when your boss emails you. So very useful, especially if you're out and about, you got something that's burning coming at you from the boss. And here's an example of what that flow would actually look like. So let's just say I want to make sure that anytime my boss emails me that I know and can respond as quick as possible. So this flow will leverage Office 365 and Slack. When you receive an email from your boss, the flow is going to send you a notification. So in Microsoft Power Automate, as well as many of the popular solutions, any action that will require developer input are automatically expanded out. And what you see on the right-hand side is an example of that very flow. Very simple box diagram that's saying, hey, on a new email, pull up my profile. I want the manager in place, so that way I can check to see, is this email from my boss, so my boss's email? If so, send me a Slack notification. If not, do nothing. And the only time you actually have to expand something out is when you actually have to do any sort of data entry for it. So it makes it very easy for you to build out a flow. Very much a fill-in-the-blank template for yourself. So the Power Automate flows, and you will see in each tool has similar set of flows that you can sort of pull out and just do fill in the blanks for, have a lot of built-in services that will limit the additional programming needed. And that's why RPA has become very popular, is you don't have to worry about that sort of technical hurdle to be successful. So you can also take a peek if you wanted to in the code and do things more programmatic, as in make alterations to existing templates to go as deep technically as you want, but you're not required to. I mentioned earlier that we talk a little bit about the AI builder. So this is something where you've got multiple model types within Power Automate that you can use. Things that we will traditionally look for in the data science field, like category classification, language detection, prediction, form processing, object detection, etc. So you can do things like automate your expense reports, categorize user feedback based upon their focus, identify and classify customer feedback, identify fraudulent transactions, or get alerted to social media posts that reference your brand. I can provide another real-time example is we would have customers that would email us, and they originally would email analysts asking for specific information from Bloomberg machines that we had access to that they did not. Put a bot in place that would act as that listener that would wait for the customer requesting information. It would scan through that email, then access the Bloomberg machine, generate the reports that were needed to, and then send those to the analyst for an initial review, just to make sure that the bot did what it was supposed to do, that it pulled down the reports that match what the customer asked, and then it would send off those reports. So that's an example of something that is going to save you time, that it's looking for natural language processing, and ends up making it much easier because the customers are going to get a response more quickly. So this is the last example I'm going to give of a tool, and it's sort of the big boy in the space. So it's UiPath. So they also offer cloud orchestration, integration, testing, as well as AI. They have more than 3,000 clients, including many Fortune 500 companies. They were valued in 2021 at 35 billion. This last year hasn't been kind for a lot of the automation solutions. I believe they're now valued closer to 15 billion. So why has UiPath become so popular in the industry? Well, they've got good marketing program. So they got out there early with a lot of, say, professional groups and webinars to get access to that market. They put in place a robust and free training program. So if you wanted to become certified a few years ago, that certification was free. You just had to go through the training and take the examination. They have multiple tiers of their IDE to fit the technical skill set. That is to say, if you are a business analyst and you've never coded a line in your life, we have an IDE for you. If you are a developer who have experience over many years with multiple languages, we have an IDE that's going to fit your needs. And we will allow the transfer between one IDE to another of those flows that allows our analyst to develop something, pass it over to our developer to then build out the flow along with the necessary test coverage. UiPath also has support for most standard tech stacks with pre-built activities. So, at this point, because they are large and because they've built in a lot of these libraries for flows that you have specific use cases for, it becomes very easy to pull down and use those flows. And they've integrated with a lot of other technology firms just to make it very easy for you to fit UiPath within your tech stack. And they have Test Manager, which was released a few years ago after Ingo Philipp joined the company. And I'll explain that in a little bit. So as I mentioned, UiPath went public last year. And why is this important though? Why would I care about a company going public like this? Well, you saw how many I listed earlier in that tool comparison, and that some of the firms were being bought up. So you care about investing a tool that's going to be in it for the long term. You want to make sure that they have a good product vision and that the support will be in place for long term, and they're not going to be gobbled up by someone else and suddenly the tool will go away, or you're going to have to make a transition period to go to whatever new form of the tool is going to be. So you want to have someone who's always going to be a leader, and the leader is going to help you in the form of having those pre-built libraries, as I mentioned a few times. Having those pre-built libraries will drastically reduce the time that you take from ideation to implementation. So let's dive in to some of those examples. So this is the Studio Pro from UiPath that allows you to create automated tests. You can have a Studio X version for those less technically adept team members to create workflows and then import them into Studio Pro. And you can see it on the right-hand side that it's taking that format that you often see in BDD style acceptance criteria of a given, when, then. You too can do that within UiPath, and you can have it be in a simple format for people to adopt. Their testing capabilities have activity coverage, so you can confirm that the activities you create also have appropriate test coverage associated with it. You can do support for other technologies. In this case, you can have support with API testing via Postman. So you can import your collections from Postman. So having those integrations with other testing tools is important to making sure that your RPA solution can be successful because it fits neatly within your tech stack. And you have the orchestrator. The orchestrator is where we can execute those test cases as well as your flows. And the Studio Pro can execute via the orchestrator. So you can kick off execution of those test cases and send a direct API call to your orchestrator to do so and get feedback. So this way you don't have to worry about having all execution just be on your local machine. You can set up execution remotely. And I mentioned before with a couple of the features available that you've got natural language processing, optical character recognition, machine learning. It's pretty much whatever challenge you may have, whether it's web, desktop, database, mainframe, services. You want to be able to have the capability of finding a solution for it and having multiple paths to you having that solution in place. And that's really what a successful tool will do. It will give you that flexibility of choosing the path that will work best for you and your company. So the test manager tool can be used to help manage those tests, while the Studio Pro, the IDE, is for automating those tests. And then you have those orchestrator and those robots that are there to help organize the test execution, as well as actually fulfill those tests. What we want to do is have an integration. We don't want to have multiple sources of truth. We want to be able to have a hub that can go back and update our project tracking tools. So that way we can say, hey, here's new defects that we found, or we have coverage of our requirements, or we just want to have logged information because we have to provide that information to internal audit or external audit. So having a full integration of your tech stack is vitally important. So the test manager allows you to do that. It has several connectors. These are libraries used to connect to external ALM tools. So that way you can synchronize between them. One of the most painful things is to have a tool that has, say, like your test cases, and another one that also has reference to your test cases, but they're not connected. So you have to update both of them separately. We want to have synchronization between those tools. So that way we can find out that, yes, these test cases, whether they be manual or automated, once they're executed, they're updated in both places. Those automated test cases that are created in the Studio Pro can be linked back to the test manager. So we can execute, see success and fail. We can have those manual test cases be executed, show success or fail, attach screenshots if we wanted to, create defects from them. And we want to be able to quickly create those cases as well. So one of the cool aspects of this, and I'd say other tools in the industry, is the task capture. It's more trying to sit there with that subject matter expert, or trying for that subject matter expert to have a written report out for what exactly flow they need to automate. It's much easier if you have task capture baked in, which is going to document those flows without manually downloading the images or typing them in. So this will capture each step and take screenshots with every mouse click that'll collect the data along the way. This will allow you to quickly create those requirements you need for the automated flow that you can then publish, say, as a test case that you can have then someone work off of. So they can keep track pretty much of everything that you've done to more quickly create those requirements. From a testing standpoint, we care about some of the sort of essentials for any sort of test reporting tool. It's like, can we categorize it, like smoke test, regression, or a release? Can our orchestrator be used for the automated execution to provide a full report back? Can we include things of, when was it executed? Was it a pass or fail? How long did it take? What are overall results? Can I have a big visual that I can share with the management? And that's what you'd expect in any sort of test execution tool. And that's what's available for you here. So you want to be able to dive in further and see from the individual steps, where did I have that failure? What were the error messages? What are some screenshots at the point of the failure? So we want to match our RPA solution and expand for those testing capabilities, but not lose out on any of the functionality we expect from traditional automation. So when you're building out your program, you want to be able to check to say, yes, we're making progress, or exactly how well are we doing? So keeping track of your work is essential for this program, because your RPA solution is just like another application you're devoting time to develop. And you want to make sure for that time and resource investment that you're getting your money's worth. So what should you measure? The viability of that implementation, justifying your initial investment, making iterative improvements, helping making evidence-based decisions. What are some of the stages you can go through? Because at different points of your implementation, you're going to want to look at different things. So the initial pilot stage should measure your foundational work. Your mature stage should look at the long-term benefits with enhancements you can make. One of the challenges is understanding what exactly is the cost of doing business for activities. So say, for instance, to this point in time, you've always had people come in and, hey, you receive an email and you got to do data entry to a desktop application. You don't know exactly how long that takes because it's not something you've ever tracked. So you have to do a lot of back of the envelope calculations on about how much time did this take a person to do, and how many activities do they have to do it in a given day, in a given week, in a given month, in a given quarter. So this is not going to be an exact science when you're trying to determine what the cost of business is for certain activities. And then also in some instances, you're not going to know what their sort of error rate is, because they will go back and fix it later and it's not something that's captured. So you keep track of that as a back of the envelope, and you look at other things that can help you out, such as your adoption rate. So what is your initial set of RPA test cases that you can develop, and how many have you actually delivered? So that's your adoption rate. Your overall cost savings. By implementing the solution, are there other pieces of technology that you've been able to retire and reduce in tech stack size? So that's another benefit. Or are there equivalent people that you're accounting for now? In the example that I gave earlier about helping out with service desk analysts, it found that we ended up saving about 2 service desk analysts worth of time. That doesn't necessarily mean you reduce the staff size. It just means that their workload has become lighter so they could focus on more cognitively important tasks, and providing the faster feedback and resolution for customers as well as colleagues is another benefit. And that's where we go into time savings. So the time spent per workflow. We want to look at the time that you spent completing that workflow and the downtime and stages of the workflow that is reduced. Going back to, again, one of my earlier examples of you have a 3-day long pipeline to complete mortgage loan origination. A lot of that is downtime where you're reaching out to third parties for approvals. I want to have a bot sitting there as a listener, waiting for that response and then continuing through, rather than a human waiting for that and maybe checking on it at a later point in time. It ends up taking longer for the human to do it versus a bot that is constantly listening. The output improvement is the pre and post implementation output for a workflow. So, as well as enhanced accuracy, which is the number of errors you have for a given workflow. And again, this is something that you may have to take an estimation on because you don't have that exact number. And that's okay. Just make sure you're upfront about reporting that within your organization. And lastly, security. So you want to look at the number of vulnerabilities measured and the number of controls in the bots versus people. If you can replace tasks that people are doing with bots doing them, but you have more controls on those bots than you do for people, you've therefore lowered your security profile. From the mature stage, we look at time to completion. So the time it takes to complete a process manually before and after implementation. And again, this is something where you may have to take that back of the envelope calculation on. As you get better as an organization, you'll have tasks that you have more defined data on at the outset. The task accuracy is to compare the rework time plus the cost of implementing that task. Your downtime reduction is the downtime needed to complete a workflow by humans versus that bot. Your employee happiness. This is one that I haven't mentioned up to this point in time, but it is actually quite critical. So you're going to survey those employees who are targeted to have RPA tasks implemented. Why is this a metric you should care about? Well, what I found from my own history is that anytime you go into work into a new team, you're going to say, we're going to implement some automation to do some of the tasks that you're doing today. That person's mind immediately goes to, I'm going to be replaced with a robot. And they will come back with either fear or some form of resentment because they think that they're going to be replaced. And it's not about replacing people. It's about taking away those repetitive, time-consuming tasks so they can do something that is better suited for a human being to do. And so you need to be upfront about what the overall purpose is of the program and what exactly you're automating and what they will be doing instead of those activities. So gauging their happiness before and after implementation is an important component of that. And then one other item you look at is that yearly compliance. So twice a year, I have to go in for compliance for our organization's testing activities. It's much easier if you have all of those audit-related activities assisted with the log information. So you can provide that to your auditors and save yourself some time and potentially a reduction in regulatory fines because you show that you have the necessary controls in place and you're keeping track of the necessary data you need to. So whichever one of these or set of these that you actually look for, it's just important to make sure that your progress should be visible. So it should be easily trackable, accurate, consistent, and objective. You want to focus on key operation metrics like the utilization of the bots and capacity versus the manual tasks you have. Most of those commercial tools in place have baked in analytics capabilities. So why not use them within the orchestration tool rather than have it be data that is just simply lost to the aether? What are some of the key takeaways we've had in today's session? Well, there's a few things that we need to keep track of. One of those is simply that anytime you have people that are sponsoring POC for an RPA project, you need to have those sponsors work side by side with the development team in implementing the solution. So you can build a shared understanding on what success looks like and what are those key performance indicators. You want the RPA team to maintain a consistent pace of work, just like any application development team. You'll reach a point when you're building this out for your team or for the enterprise where you'll have many more flows, use cases coming in than you can possibly automate. You need to build the program at a steady, successful rate, targeting reuse for certain flows over reaching into new space. So that way you build up a successful body of work that you can then extend out to additional flows. And no one metric that I showed you today is going to determine success or failure of a program. The telemetry should be used as context to drive decisions rather than as a target, because as soon as you attach targets to it, people are going to automate to hit those targets rather than for improvement of your team or your company. So if you're interested in learning more about RPA, I've included this presentation on SlideShare. And also there's a chapter in a book that I co-wrote with Aaron Kinsbrunner and a few others that has to do with RPA. You can feel free to check that out. And if you liked a lot of the images that I showed in this presentation, I recommend you check out Ineffable Solutions. So a colleague of mine, Damien Sinadinos, did a lot of the water art on that. The other ones that you saw were, of course, taken from classical art. So thank you very much for your time. Let me stop sharing. All right, I'm going to answer a few of the questions I see in chat. What do you think about the future of test automation for desktop applications? Well, I'd say most of the popular tools in the industry already account for desktop-based applications. Like Automation Anywhere was originally for desktop applications. You can do so with UiPath, with Power Automate, Blue Prism, and most of the tools in the industry. I'd say like web is where I'd say we go with like test automation traditionally, just because there's so many web applications and there's so many tools available for us. But when you're going to implement for your team or your company, you're going to go beyond working with simple web applications. All right, on another, how do you calculate the ROI of your RPA deployment and measure RPA success? All right, so I showed you a few of those of just simply looking at here's the number of candidate flows, how many we've implemented for each one of those flows. What are you getting back from that? Like you have to set that from the beginning when you're defining it. So for instance, the example that I gave with opening up all those applications on a service desk analyst machine to more quickly help a customer, you're looking at something that is strictly time-based. Like how many seconds are we saving per interaction? And then multiply that by the number of events that you have to go through, say, on a given year to give you back the ROI. Another can be based upon that employee happiness. If I have to go through as someone in HR and have to type in the same exact things when I'm doing onboarding for someone versus I just need to have the core information from that person and the rest of the onboarding is taken care of by a bot, I'm just looking at my happiness before and after that process as part of that positive feedback. The other is like looking at number of errors that you have. And this is where you may have to do back the envelope calculations if you're tracking it versus things that you can track because the applications do so already. And you can look at the pre and post implementation for success. There's a lot of different things that you can look into if you want to say set your goal for like this is the ROI we're providing. It's not just about time-based, happiness, the reduction in downtime, etc. Are there any other questions or comments or concerns? If not, I'd say there's a few things. I know Zappeltech are our gracious host today. They're based in Krakow, Poland. So I want to give much thanks and a lot of good vibes to Poland for doing so much in the humanitarian space these last few weeks. And I know that some of the employees for Zappeltech are based out of Ukraine. So I hope you stay safe and the events that are transpiring today reach a quick conclusion so that way you can return to your homes. This is where we run into some issues where we don't have the moderator in place. So I will say thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Take care.